The Littorio class were the first and last Italian battleships to be built after the First World War, and their design history would be even more complicated than that of their French rivals. After the Washington Naval Treaty of 1922, Italy was given up to 70,000 tons worth of new capital ship displacement as an allowance to expand and upgrade their fleet. However, this presented a problem. The maximum displacement for an individual battleship was 35,000 tons, which meant that only a pair of ships could be built to this standard. This was an issue because ships need periodic maintenance and training, so 3 ships is generally seen as the minimum you need to have at least one of them guaranteed in service at any one time. And so, in 1928, the first design put forward was a 23,000-ton ship with 6 15-inch guns in twin turrets, a bit like a slightly smaller version of the British Renown-class battlecruiser. This would allow for 3 ships to be built. Armour and available fuel were reduced to keep the ships down to this weight limit, although since the Italians did not expect to operate outside the Mediterranean, this lack of endurance was not so much of an issue. As a follow-up, a larger class displacing 35,000 tons with a similar layout but with 16-inch guns instead of 15-inch weapons and much heavier armour was prepared. Neither of these were ordered, though, because Italy and France both wanted to save money and had an unwritten understanding that one side would not build new ships if the other one likewise refrained. But in 1930, the Germans began to build the Graf Zeppelin and her sisters of the Deutschland class, and as we've seen previously, the French countered with the Dunkirk class. Now France was building, Italy had to respond, and they first considered an 18,000-ton design like the German ships, but with 13.5-inch guns instead of 11-inch guns. This was deemed impractical, and a larger design of 26,500 tons with 8 13.5-inch guns in twin turrets was prepared. This was also abandoned in favour of a 35,000-ton design armed with 16-inch guns, only for the designers to realise the Italians didn't actually have any 16-inch guns, nor did they have any plans to build any. Raiding the archives, they did however find they had designs for a 15-inch gun for a class that had been cancelled during the First World War. And so they decided that the final design would carry 9 modified 15-inch guns in 3 triple turrets, 2 forward in the superfiring position and 1 at the rear. They also decided to throw out the treaty limits and design the ships with 40,000 tons displacement, and at last the Littorio class was born. The ship's main battery would consist of long-barrel, high-velocity, slow-firing guns with extremely long range. Unfortunately, as it would turn out in battle, the accuracy of these guns varied wildly from engagement to engagement, the most likely culprit being the shells and charges, which had a rather wide tolerance as far as these things go in terms of their overall weight, which could lead to radically different dispersions of different shells even if they'd been fired from the same turret. The secondary battery consisted of 12 6-inch guns in 4 triple turrets, with a pair on either side of the second and third main turrets. 4 single 4.7-inch guns supplemented these, and the anti-aircraft battery was quite powerful, with 12 90mm, 20 37mm, and 16 20mm cannon all clustered in the centre of the ship. At 30 knots, the ships were also fast, even for the time period, and they aimed to protect themselves from torpedoes with a unique defence system, named after its designer Umberto Pugliese. The basic idea was to have a liquid-filled defensive layer with a central hollow and empty drum. A torpedo impact would transmit its shockwave through the liquid and the drum would collapse, the energy of the explosion being dissipated by this action. Although it was a good idea in principle, it didn't perform as well as designed in some instances, partly because the narrow hull meant that large sections of the system were not built as wide as they should have been, together with a few faults in construction and the fact that ultimately, as you can see from the diagram above, the system took up a vast amount of space and so in any case was rather inefficient. The armour layer was also unique. Instead of a single thick main belt, there was an interior belt 11 inches thick. This alone was quite thin and would be easily defeated by modern battleship shells. However, a 9.8-inch gap separated it from the outer hull, where a 2.8-inch belt was supposed to break off the armour-penetrating cap of an incoming shell, and the gap then allowing the cap to separate from the shell, and the resulting projectile would then shatter against the inner belt. But there's a lot of question over whether or not this would have worked, since tests done by other navies indicate that both the gap and the outer layer were actually far too small for this to have worked properly, leaving the ship vulnerable to 15 and 16-inch gunfire. There's some suggestion that this issue was addressed by filling the intervening gap with concrete, but if this was the case, then the entire system would have weighed about as much as a solid 17-inch thick armour belt, which would have ended up being far more effective and taken up far less space. As it turned out, despite the ship's intensive use, they were never hit by heavy naval gunfire, so we're never going to know the effectiveness for certain, although it is interesting to note that the Italian Navy dropped both forms of protection in favour of more traditional systems when it came to designing the theoretical follow-ons. A total of 4 ships were ordered. The Littorio and Vittorio Veneto started construction in 1934, and the Roma, along with the Impero, were started in 1938. 3 of the ships were completed, with the Impero being launched, but it was never finished. Thanks to the unique nature of these ships and their extensive design background, we've run into a time limit. Therefore, there'll be an additional video following this one detailing the service histories of the Littorio class vessels.
That's it for this video. Thanks for watching. If you have a comment or suggestion for a ship to review, let us know in the comments below. Don't forget to comment on the pinned post for dry dock questions.